There is a house in the hills where the wind carries dust like whispers across its rotting porch. Its windows are dark most nights, yet some say they have seen a faint glow behind the glass, as if a lantern swings slowly in an unseen hand. The wood is warped, the paint eaten away by rain and time, but the shape of it still looms against the sky, stubborn and watchful. No one lives here. No one has for decades. Still, the people in town speak carefully when they talk about it, as though the walls themselves might overhear. They tell of footsteps pacing in the upstairs hall, steady and measured, the kind that do not belong to a trespasser, but to someone who believes they still own the floor beneath them. Inside, the air is heavy and stale, yet beneath the smell of mildew there is another scent, faint and metallic, like rust or dried blood. Rusted tools lie scattered in the barn, their blades dulled, their handles swollen with rot. In the kitchen, a single chair rests on its side, as though someone left in a hurry and never came back to set it upright. The wallpaper in the back room is scorched and curled, though no fire ever touched the rest of the house. In certain corners, the light bends strangely, as if the air is thicker there. Those who have stepped inside speak of a stillness that feels deliberate, a silence that presses against the eardrums. It is not the emptiness of a home left behind. It is the watchful quiet of something waiting. The Colemans once lived here, a family whose name is carved into old town ledgers and whispered with unease in the diner at the edge of town. Their history is a knot of births, deaths, and disappearances, tangled with rumors that no one can prove, and yet no one dares to dismiss. Records tell one story, the people who remember tell another, and somewhere between the two lies a truth, too strange to belong entirely to the living. Standing in those hollow rooms, it is hard not to imagine the weight of the years pressing down, layer upon layer of breath, shadow and memory. The walls seem to hold their own secrets, etched deep into the grain of the wood. This is where it began, they say. But even now, no one can agree on whether the house keeps the memory of the family, or the family keeps the memory of the house. In the spring of 1823, a man named Elias Coleman arrived in the valley with little more than a wagon, a few tools, and the quiet determination of someone who had left too much behind. The land he bought stretched wild and unbroken, a sweep of tangled woods and stubborn earth that seemed to resist the touch of the plow. Local records describe him as a man of discipline, his face weathered, his words few. He kept to himself, working long hours in silence, the sound of his axe echoing through the hills. Yet there was something about him that unsettled the neighbors, though no one could say exactly why. It was in the letters that the first shadow appeared. Folded in brittle paper, tucked between old land deeds and tax receipts, they were written in a hurried hand from someone in Elias's hometown. The words were uneven, almost frantic. They warned him not to bring the family's curse across state lines. They spoke of things that could not be buried, of a darkness that clung to blood like a stain. They begged him to stay away from fresh soil, as if the very act of planting roots would awaken something best left sleeping. Elias never spoke of these letters. Perhaps he burned some. Perhaps he kept them as a reminder, hidden from sight, but never from mind. When he began building his house, the work went quickly, almost unnaturally so for a man alone. The first stones were laid in a line that followed no clear pattern, a foundation angled against the slope in a way that made the structure seem slightly off balance, even before the walls rose. Some swore they saw him working at night, his lantern swaying in the dark while he placed each stone with deliberate care, as if following instructions no one else could see. By the time the house stood finished, the air around it already felt different, stiller, heavier. The soil by the front steps was darker than the rest of the ground, and rainwater lingered there longer than it should. People in town began to speak of the Coleman name with lowered voices. They did not know what the curse was, only that it was older than the man who bore it, and that it had traveled with him across miles of road to settle here, beneath this roof. The house was meant to be a place of safety, of beginnings, But from the moment its foundation touched the earth, it seemed to belong to something else entirely. Elias Coleman married Margaret Blackwell on a cold afternoon in late November, when the sky hung low and grey over the valley. There was no grand ceremony, no gathering of neighbours, only the faint toll of the church bell and the hurried signatures on a marriage record that looked almost ashamed of itself. It was said the two had known each other for only weeks, though some whispered that their meeting had been arranged long before Elias ever set foot on this land. Margaret was not like the other women in town. She kept her head covered even indoors, her eyes sharp and restless, as if always listening for something beyond the walls. People called her a woman of midnight habits, for she was often seen walking alone in the fields after the sun had gone, her dark skirts trailing over the grass, her lips moving in a language no one recognized. She never carried a lantern, yet somehow she never stumbled in the dark. In the weeks after the wedding, the Coleman house took on a different air. Curtains were drawn tighter, and a faint, unfamiliar scent lingered in the rooms, sweet but sharp, almost medicinal. A neighbour's wife, who kept a diary of small-town observations, wrote of watching Margaret from her kitchen window one night. She saw her standing still at the far edge of the property, facing the woods, her hands raised slightly, fingers curled as if she were holding something invisible. The neighbour could not hear the words, but she swore they were not prayers. Soon after, small changes began to ripple through the household. Elias, once a man of steady routine, grew more withdrawn, his work in the fields interrupted by long absences inside the house. Animals that wandered too close to the Colemans' property became skittish, sometimes disappearing altogether. By spring, Margaret was with child, though the pregnancy was marked by odd turns, bouts of sudden illness, dreams that left her waking with scratches on her arms, and a faint blue cast to her skin that came and went without cause. When the baby was born, the midwife left the house pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what she had seen. Some in town believed Elias and Margaret had been brought together by chance, others thought it was a bond forged long before either could choose. But those who knew the look of their eyes when they stood together, not with warmth, but with a strange and heavy knowing, believed their marriage was never about love at all. It was an oath. And oaths, once spoken, are not easily broken. Thomas Coleman was born in the late summer of 1825, when the air was thick with heat and the fields stood tall with grain. From the moment he opened his eyes, those who saw him remarked on the way he looked at the world. His gaze did not dart or wander like other infants. It fixed itself, steady and unblinking, on the faces before him, as though measuring them against some memory too deep for his years. Visitors called him beautiful, with pale skin and dark hair, but there was something in his expression that unsettled them. It was not the softness of a newborn, but the weight of someone who had already seen too much. As Thomas grew, the unease around him grew as well. By the time he could walk, the family's dogs avoided him, lowering their heads and stepping aside when he passed. Cats would arch and hiss without provocation. Even horses turned restless when he approached, their ears twitching at something unseen. Elias dismissed it as nonsense, but Margaret only watched in silence, her eyes unreadable. At 7 years old, Thomas began speaking of deaths in the town. He would mention names at the breakfast table, his voice calm, and later that day word would come of an accident or an illness taking the very person he had named. Sometimes he gave details. The color of the scarf a man had been wearing, the exact spot on the riverbank where a body would be found, though no one had told him these things. Neighbors who once visited the Coleman house began to keep their distance, crossing the street when they saw the boy. The few who still came left quickly, unsettled by the way his eyes seemed to follow them even after they turned away. Elias tried to steer his son toward farm work, but Thomas showed little interest. He preferred to wander the edges of the property, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, or standing perfectly still for long minutes, as if listening to something in the wind. In him, the Coleman's strange inheritance began to take shape, a mixture of knowledge and presence that felt as much a burden as a gift. Those who remembered him later would say Thomas was the first sign of a pattern that would not break, a thread running through the family's bloodline that blurred the boundary between the living and the dead. And with him, that thread had only just begun to tighten. In the summer of 1834, the Coleman farm seemed to fall away from the living world. The change came gradually at first. They missed a Sunday at church, then two, then every service that followed. The fields, once neat and furrowed, grew wild with weeds. No smoke curled from the chimney, even in the cool of morning. The sound of tools striking wood or earth, always present on the Coleman land, was gone. Weeks passed in this stillness, until it was as though the house itself had been abandoned. Yet at night, some swore they saw a faint light flicker behind the upstairs windows, moving slowly from one room to the next. By midsummer, a quiet unease had settled over the town. No one had seen Elias, Margaret, or young Thomas beyond their gate in months. The animals that grazed near the property returned skittish, their ribs showing. It was finally agreed that a small group would go and see if the family needed help. They set out at dawn, walking up the long dirt track with the heat of the day already pressing in around them. When they reached the house, the front door stood closed, but not locked. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying a faint sour smell like something left too long in the sun. The rooms were dim, curtains drawn against the summer light. Elias was the first they saw, standing at the far end of the kitchen. His skin was pale, almost grey, and he looked thinner, the shape of his cheekbones stark beneath the skin. He greeted them in a voice that was slow, each word drawn out as though he had to think carefully before speaking. Margaret appeared behind him, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the floor. Thomas sat at the table, unmoving, his gaze locked on the visitors without a word. The townsfolk asked if they were unwell, if they needed food, if something had happened. The answers came haltingly, almost rehearsed, as if the family had agreed on what could be said. Yes, they were fine. No, nothing was wrong. No, they did not need anything. The group left unsettled, feeling they had intruded on something they could not name. Later, one of the visitors told of seeing faint lines drawn in chalk along the baseboards of the kitchen and the hall, shapes that did not look like measurements or marks for repair. Another swore she had heard a low hum in the back room, though no one else claimed to hear it. The official account of that summer records nothing more than a period of seclusion, but those who passed the Coleman farm during those long weeks remembered the silence differently. It was not the quiet of a family keeping to themselves. It was the quiet of a house holding its breath, waiting for something to be completed. Something that once done could never be undone. It began with the sheep. One morning, Elias found 3 of them lying side by side in the far pasture, their wool matted, but their bodies strangely unmarked. Only when he drew closer did he see that their eyes were clouded, their tongues darkened, and that not a drop of blood remained in them. The skin was unbroken, no teeth marks, no torn flesh, yet they were empty, as if something had taken the life from them without ever touching the surface. Within weeks, more animals followed. Chickens collapsed in their coop stiff before dawn. A cow was found in the barn, her great body hollow of sound and breath, her milk pale and watery in the pail from the night before. Elias told the neighbors it was wolves, though he admitted the wounds, or lack of them, made no sense. He said the animals must have been carried off and returned for reasons beyond knowing, but the tracks around the barn told another story. They twisted in looping shapes, overlapping, doubling back, sometimes ending abruptly in the middle of open ground. No paw prints matched, as if whatever had moved there changed its shape with each step. One evening, a farmer passing by in the fading light caught sight of something in the Coleman field. It was Thomas, now 9 years old, kneeling in the dirt with his head bowed, both hands buried deep in the soil. The farmer called his name, but the boy did not turn. His lips moved in a whisper too soft to carry, though the field was still and no wind stirred. The man swore later that the earth beneath the boy's hands seemed to shift, as if it were breathing. By the end of that summer, the ground closest to the house had darkened to a deep, almost black shade. Rainwater pooled there longer than anywhere else, and when it sank away, the soil gave off a faint, metallic smell. Margaret planted nothing in that patch, yet it seemed to grow things of its own accord. Tangled shoots that sprouted overnight and withered just as quickly, leaving behind thin, brittle husks. The townsfolk began to speak less of wolves and more of the land itself, wondering if whatever haunted the Coleman family had sunk its roots deep into the ground. Some said the earth remembered things, that it could be taught to keep them. And on certain nights, when the moon hung low and red over the fields, a few claimed they could see shapes moving beneath the surface, tracing the same impossible patterns left in the soil. It was found years later, tucked inside a narrow compartment beneath the bottom drawer of Margaret's sewing table. The wood panel was cut so precisely that it blended with the grain, invisible unless you knew exactly where to press. Inside lay a small leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth and dark with age. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary ledger, the kind a housewife might keep for tracking expenses. But there were no lists of flour or fabric, no tallies of debts and payments. Instead, each page was lined with dates, written in Margaret's sharp, deliberate hand. Beside each date was a name. Some names were familiar: farmers, shopkeepers, children who had played in the street. Others belonged to people no one remembered. Each entry was paired with a note of the moon's phase, and in some cases, a time written down to the exact minute. The most unsettling detail was not the names themselves, but the way the dates matched the deaths recorded in the town's church register. Accidents, fevers, stillbirths, all had been written here days, sometimes weeks, before they occurred. The further one read, the stranger the ledger became. Certain entries were crossed through with an ink darker than the rest, the lines not straight but curling, as though shaped into symbols. The marks were unlike any letters in English, curling into loops and jagged points, their meaning unreadable yet deliberate. These crossed-out names often belonged to those who had died in ways people could not explain, found far from home, missing for days, or simply gone without a trace. The precision of Margaret's record-keeping left little room for coincidence. Was she predicting these deaths, seeing them before they came? Or was the ledger not a record of what she knew, but a list of what she intended? Those who held the book said the air around it felt colder, that the leather seemed to grow warmer the longer it was touched, as though something in it still lived. Among the earliest entries was the name of a man from her hometown, dated years before the Colemans settled here. His death was recorded just as precisely, and the moon beside it marked as waning crescent. The handwriting never faltered from the first page to the last, steady and patient, as if the act of writing was part of something larger, a rhythm, a duty. When the ledger was closed and returned to its hiding place, it left behind the heavy sense that the deaths it contained had not been random. They had been counted, and counting, as Margaret seemed to know too well, is the first step in keeping track of what belongs to you. It happened on a windless night in the autumn of 1842. The barn on the Coleman property erupted in flames so bright they could be seen from the far edge of town. The air shimmered with heat, and the crack of burning timber carried through the stillness. Neighbors ran toward the glow, expecting to find Elias and Thomas struggling to save what they could. The fire burned with an intensity that seemed unnatural, the heat forcing even the most determined back several paces. Inside, iron tools glowed red and began to twist, their shapes bending as though in pain. The roof groaned and sagged, and everyone watching knew it would soon collapse. Then, without warning, the flames were gone. Not faded, not smothered, but gone, as if someone had snuffed out a candle in a single breath. The air cooled instantly, the night returning to its ordinary chill. Where moments before there had been roaring fire, there was now only darkness and the faint smell of smoke. The barn stood exactly as it had before, its boards unblackened, its roof unbroken. Even the hay inside lay in neat stacks, dry and untouched. Those who had witnessed it could not agree on what they'd seen. Some swore the fire had simply been a trick of the eye, perhaps caused by moonlight and fog. Others insisted they had heard the wood splitting, had felt the heat on their faces. One man said he saw movement in the doorway just before the fire vanished, a figure standing still in the shadows, watching the crowd. He could not say whether it was Elias or Thomas, only that the figure did not move and did not seem surprised. The next day, Elias offered no explanation. He repaired nothing, replaced nothing, as if there had been no fire at all. But word spread quickly through the town, and the whispers began. People spoke of bargains struck in secret, of debts owed to something not entirely human. They said the Colemans had been spared because they belonged to whatever ruled that land, and that the fire had not failed to destroy the barn. It had been called away. Long after, some claimed that if you stood in the barn at night, you could still feel a faint warmth beneath your feet, as though embers smoldered far below the floor. Others avoided the place entirely, unwilling to test whether what had spared the barn might notice them too. Whatever had happened that night, it was the first time the darkness surrounding the Colemans stepped plainly into view. And once seen, it could never be unseen again. Thomas Coleman married Lydia Hale in the spring. When the trees were still pale with new leaves and the river ran high from melted snow. Lydia was a quiet woman, a school teacher from a nearby town, with a gentle voice and eyes that seemed to listen more than they looked. The wedding was small, just a handful of neighbors, and the sound of the wind moving through the fields. At first, life on the Coleman farm seemed calm. Jonathan was born within a year, a healthy child with his mother's light hair and his father's dark, steady eyes. Elias, now older, warned Thomas not to change the land, not to disturb what had already been claimed. But Thomas, restless and determined, began to expand the farm. He cut deeper into the forest, clearing space for new fields. The sound of axes echoed where there had once been only bird call and the low rustle of leaves. With each tree that fell, the air around the house seemed to grow heavier, the nights colder. It started with small things, a fever that clung to Thomas for weeks, a strange rash along Lydia's arms, coughs that came and went without reason. Jonathan cried through the night, not from hunger or pain, but from something no one could name. Lydia wrote letters to her sister during these long nights, her neat handwriting trembling across the page. She begged her to come, to take the baby away, to keep him safe from whatever had taken hold here. The letters spoke of the woods at night, of shadows that moved when there was no wind, of the feeling that the house was breathing with them, waiting for something. She wrote of waking to find Jonathan's crib turned slightly from where it had been, of hearing a low hum in the floorboards beneath her bed. But these letters were never sent. Decades later, they were found under the nursery floor, bundled in twine and browned with age. The ink had faded in places, but the desperation in the words had not. One page ended mid-sentence, the last line breaking off as though she had been interrupted. In the years that followed, neighbors saw less of Lydia. She moved quietly through town when she came at all. Her shoulders bent, her gaze lowered. Jonathan grew, his face solemn for a boy so young, his eyes reflecting something older than his years. The farm stretched wider now, but its heart felt narrower, as though the space Thomas had claimed from the forest had been given over to something else entirely. It was a clear morning when Thomas stepped out onto the porch and found the house quieter than it had ever been. Lydia was gone. Her shoes were still beside the bed, her coat still hanging by the door. In the center of the porch lay her wedding ring, the gold dulled by a layer of fine gray ash. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no footprints in the dirt beyond the steps. Thomas told the neighbors she had left on her own, that she needed time away, but his voice carried none of the certainty such words require. When the sheriff searched the house, he found nothing out of place except for a small stack of papers tucked inside the desk in the upstairs bedroom. They were diary pages in Lydia's hand, the ink hurried and uneven. The entries began weeks before her disappearance, the tone growing more frantic with each passing day. She wrote of strange knocks in the walls at night, of a faint scratching sound that seemed to follow her from room to room. She spoke of whispers that rose up through the floorboards, words she could not understand but felt in her bones. "I think something moves in the walls," one line read. "Not rats. Not anything I know. It waits until I am alone." In another entry, she described waking to find the bed shaking gently, though Thomas slept soundly beside her. She wrote of the smell of damp earth in the nursery, of a low voice speaking beneath Jonathan's crib while he lay still and silent. The final pages were smudged, the words crowded together, almost illegible. The last entry ended abruptly, as if she had been pulled from the desk before she could finish. The town organized a search, fanning out across the fields and into the woods. They called her name until their voices cracked, but no answer came back. Dogs brought to track her scent lost it near the old creek, where the water pooled dark and still. No clothing was found, no body, no sign she had passed that way at all. After weeks with no trace, the search was called off. Thomas boarded up the upstairs windows and spoke even less than before. Jonathan, barely old enough to understand, began wandering the house at night, barefoot, staring at corners as though he could see someone standing there. In town, people stopped asking where Lydia had gone. They spoke of her in lowered tones, as they did of others who had vanished near the Coleman land. The house seemed heavier now, its silence deeper, as if it had swallowed something it meant to keep. Jonathan was 8. The first time a neighbor saw him outside after midnight, barefoot in the frost, moving slowly through the stubbled fields. His eyes were open, but they did not seem to register the light of the lantern waved in his direction. He didn't startle, didn't speak, only turned away and continued on, his thin nightshirt snapping lightly in the cold wind. After that night, the sightings multiplied. Sometimes he walked the fence line. Other times he stood at the far edge of the property, facing the woods as if listening for something. Those who came close enough swore they heard voices, not loud but low, like a conversation carried on in careful tones. Yet there was never anyone beside him. The strange part was the rhythm of the exchange. Jonathan would pause, tilt his head, and then respond, the way one might when spoken to. Some said the second voice was not quite right. The sound of it stretched thin, as though it had traveled too far to be heard clearly. In the mornings, he seemed tired, but otherwise unharmed. Thomas brushed it off as sleepwalking, a phase he claimed the boy would outgrow. But the pattern did not fade. Instead, the walks grew longer, reaching deep into the woods. One winter morning, long before dawn, Jonathan returned from those woods carrying something in his small hands. At first Thomas thought it was a bundle of cloth, but as the boy stepped into the lamplight, it became clear it was a doll. The face was porcelain, pale and cracked, the dress once white but now stained dark in irregular patches. The stains were not mud. When Thomas asked where he had found it, Jonathan only looked at him blankly, as though the question itself made no sense. The doll was placed in a drawer in the kitchen and left there, but by the following day it was gone. In town, the whispers began again, echoing the ones that had followed Thomas in his own childhood. The way the boy's gaze lingered too long, the way animals shied from his touch, the way he seemed to know when something bad had happened before anyone told him. But there was something different about Jonathan too, a sense that he was not just repeating the strange inheritance of his father, but shaping it into something new. Whatever had walked with Thomas as a boy was walking with Jonathan now, and perhaps it was no longer walking behind him. It was keeping pace. The summer after Jonathan turned 10, the Coleman fields erupted with life. Rows of corn stretched higher than a man's head, the stalks thick and green, the ears heavy. Pumpkins swelled to the size of barrels, their skins a deep, flawless orange. Potatoes came up from the earth so large they filled both hands, their surfaces smooth and unblemished. It was a harvest so abundant that even the oldest farmers in the valley could not recall its like. And yet, no one had seen Thomas fertilize the soil or water the crops. There had been no heavy rains, no special seed. The growth had simply happened. At first, the bounty was welcomed. The Colemans sold their produce at the market, and customers marveled at its perfection. The coins came in steadily, and Thomas stacked them in a small iron box behind the kitchen stove. But soon the stories began. A family who bought a basket of Coleman apples reported a strange taste in the fruit, faint but unmistakable, metallic, like water drawn from rusty pipes. Another family fell ill days after eating the corn, their fevers accompanied by vivid, twisting nightmares that left them gasping for air upon waking. As the weeks passed, the complaints grew darker. People spoke of seeing shapes in their rooms at night, shadows bending at the corners, faces in the window glass. One woman claimed she woke to find her husband sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide open, speaking in a voice that was not his own. By morning, he remembered nothing. When the market began to thin, Thomas stopped selling to strangers. Instead, wagons came in the night to take the harvest elsewhere, their drivers speaking little and leaving quickly. The fields remained full, as though the plants never withered, never rotted. Even after the first frost, the leaves stayed green, the fruit heavy. Those who dared to walk the Coleman land at dusk swore they could hear a faint hum in the fields, a low vibration that seemed to come from the soil itself. The plants swayed without wind, their leaves brushing together in patterns that almost sounded like words. In the town, people began to say the crops weren't meant to feed people at all, that they were meant to feed something else. Something that lived in the dark roots beneath the ground, something that had been growing alongside the plants all along. The sickness, the nightmares, the strange hunger in those who ate the food, all of it was just a side effect, a shadow of the true purpose. The harvest never failed that year. The Coleman storehouse stayed full, even when other farms withered in the heat. But the bounty had a weight to it, as if each ear of corn, each shining apple, carried more than just the taste of the earth. It carried a debt, and debts once taken from this land were never repaid in coin. When the Civil War came, the valley emptied of men. Farms were left in the hands of women, children, and the few who found ways to remain. Jonathan Coleman was among those who stayed. Some said it was his age. Others claimed a medical exemption, but most believed there was an arrangement, a quiet exchange between Thomas and certain officials that kept Jonathan's name off the lists. The war years suited the Colemans. With so many gone, there were fewer eyes on the property, fewer questions about what happened behind its closed doors. Travelers passed through the valley from time to time, deserters avoiding the front, vagrants looking for shelter, men with the hollow look of those who had been too close to death for too long. Some were seen near the Coleman land, asking for work or food. Most were never seen again. The disappearances were small enough to be overlooked. A stranger no one knew was less missed than a neighbor, and the war gave easy explanations for the missing. But those who lived closest to the farm began to notice patterns. On certain nights, a faint glow could be seen from the back fields, low to the ground, as if a fire burned beneath the soil. On others, the sound of shovels carried faintly through the still air. Jonathan himself was rarely seen in town during those years. When he did appear, he seemed older than his age, his shoulders straighter, his voice quieter. There was a hardness in him, a confidence that had not been there before. Some said he walked as if he were no longer afraid of anything. Decades later, when the house had long been abandoned, a group of boys digging behind the old smokehouse unearthed a handful of rusted metal. At first they thought it was scrap, but when the dirt fell away, they saw the shapes of Union Army dog tags, still strung on what remained of corroded chain. The names on them were worn, barely legible, but they did not match any of the local men. The find was quickly covered over, the tags reburied, whether out of fear or respect, no one could say. But word of it spread quietly among the older families in town. It was a confirmation of sorts. A whisper that the stories had been true all along. The war had not just brought the Colemans isolation, it had brought them opportunity. And in those empty years, the land seemed to take as much as it could, leaving nothing behind but the faint taste of iron in the air and the weight of things buried deep in the cold earth. The photographer came through in the summer of 1871, his wagon heavy with glass plates and the sharp, chemical smell of his trade. He had been moving from town to town, offering portraits for a modest fee, but he also liked to capture the character of the places he passed. One afternoon, while the light was still soft, he set up his tripod on the dirt road and framed the Coleman house in his lens. The fields lay quiet, the air still. No one appeared at the windows or stepped out onto the porch. Weeks later, when the plates were developed in his workshop miles away, the image revealed something he had not seen when the shutter clicked. In the upper right window of the house, just behind the wavering curtain, stood the pale outline of a woman. Her face was turned slightly toward the camera, her hair pulled back, her dress plain but old-fashioned even for that year. The eyes, though blurred by the distance, seemed fixed and knowing. Word traveled quickly when the photograph reached the valley. Those who remembered Lydia Coleman swore it was her. The same high cheekbones, the same narrow mouth. But Lydia had been gone for decades. Her disappearance never explained, her body never found. Some whispered that she had never left at all, that she had been standing in that window every day since, waiting to be seen. A few tried to explain it away. They said it was a trick of the glass plate, a double exposure caused by careless handling. The photographer himself admitted it was possible, though he claimed he had taken only one image that day. But the debate mattered little to the people who held the photograph in their hands. To them, it was proof, not of Lydia's survival, but of something far stranger. The picture began to change hands quietly, never sold but given in whispers, each new owner keeping it for a time before passing it along. Some kept it hidden in drawers, others pinned it to the underside of a cupboard shelf. It was never displayed openly, yet it was always known where it was. People claimed that keeping it close brought strange dreams, visions of standing at the edge of the Coleman fields at night, of feeling someone watching from above. By the time the photograph left the valley entirely, carried away by a man who refused to say how he'd gotten it, the story had grown sharper. The house was cursed. The family was cursed. And now there was an image to prove it. The pale figure in the window caught between leaving and staying. Her gaze locked on a world that had already tried to forget her. The birth of the twins was spoken of as a blessing at first. No twins had ever been born into the Coleman family, and Jonathan's wife, Clara, glowed with pride as she showed them to the neighbors who dared to visit. The girls were small but strong, their cries sharp and insistent, their eyes dark and unblinking. For a time, the house felt lighter, as though the sound of two infants breathing had pushed back the quiet that had settled in the rooms for years. It was Clara who first noticed the marks. A pale, curved shape on each girl's left shoulder, identical in size and position, faint at birth but darkening as the weeks passed. They were shaped like crescent moons, their edges sharp against the softness of the skin. The doctor called them harmless birthmarks, but the sight of them unsettled Clara in ways she could not explain. The girls grew quickly, their milestones reached not one at a time, but together. They rolled over the same day, took their first steps within minutes of each other. By the time they were 3, they often spoke in unison, without seeming to notice, their voices merging into a single strange harmony. Clara would walk into a room to find them standing side by side, their small hands linked, their eyes fixed on a corner or a shadow, their faces unreadable. The corners they stared at were never empty for long. Sometimes a curtain would stir without wind, or the faint sound of something shifting in the wall would follow their gaze. When asked what they were looking at, the twins would smile faintly, as if sharing a joke too private to explain. The atmosphere in the house thickened. Visitors complained of headaches after only a short stay. Lamps flickered, and cold drafts crept along the floors even in summer. Clara began to dream of the twins whispering to each other in the dark, their voices low and steady, their words impossible to make out but heavy with meaning. Jonathan seemed less disturbed. If anything, he watched his daughters with a kind of quiet satisfaction, as though they were the proof of something he had been waiting for. He did not question their strange habits, or the way they seemed to move in perfect balance with one another. In time, the twins spoke less to others and more to each other. They became a closed circle of two, bound by something no one else in the family could touch. And as their bond deepened, so too did the sense that whatever watched the Coleman family from the shadows had found, in these two small girls, the perfect mirror in which to see itself. For as long as anyone in the Coleman family could remember, the narrow door at the end of the upstairs hall had been locked. No key was ever seen, and no one spoke of what lay beyond it. The children were warned not to touch the handle, not to linger near it, not even to look at it for too long. They obeyed, not out of respect, but out of the quiet, instinctive fear that children carry without being told why. In the summer of 1892, a hired hand named Matthew came to work on the property. He was young, curious, and unbothered by the uneasy reputation of the place. One afternoon, while carrying a load of linens upstairs, his hip brushed against the locked door. The latch gave way with a sharp crack. The wood, old and brittle, had splintered just enough for the lock to break free. The door creaked open on its own. The air inside was cold. Though it was the height of summer, dust hung in the stillness, thick and slow to settle. The walls were covered in carvings, names, dates, and curling symbols that seemed almost alive in the shifting light. The marks were old, some gouged deep, others so faint they seemed to hover just above the surface. The names were unfamiliar, but the dates stretched back generations, even before the Colemans had built the house. The symbols matched the ones found in Margaret's ledger, their shapes curling into jagged points, their meaning unreadable yet deliberate. In the center of the wooden floor sat a stone basin. It was no larger than a washtub, carved from a single block of rock so dark it seemed to drink in the light. Inside, water the color of ink lay still, its surface smooth as glass. The smell of it was sharp, metallic, and wrong. Matthew bent over it and swore he saw movement beneath, though the water did not ripple. Something pale and slow drifted across the bottom, and in the moment he leaned closer, he felt as if the room tilted around him. He stumbled back, knocking against the wall. The carvings seemed to shift in the corner of his vision, as if they had been watching him. Without thinking, he pulled the door shut and jammed a chair under the handle. Later that day, he packed his belongings and left without collecting his pay. The door was repaired and locked again, and the family returned to pretending it was only a storage space. But after that summer, the upstairs hallway always seemed colder, and the boards near that door creaked on their own, as if something inside was pacing slowly, waiting for another chance to be seen. By 1910, the Coleman name had thinned to a single thread. Sarah, one of the twin daughters, was the only direct heir left. Her sister had died young under circumstances the family never discussed, and Sarah had left the valley soon after, vanishing into the cities where no one knew her name. For years, the old house stood in slow decay, its windows clouded with dust, its rooms hollowed by silence. Then, one grey afternoon, a carriage appeared on the road, and Sarah stepped out as if she had never been gone. She was in her 30s now, with sharp eyes and a voice that drew attention whether she wanted it or not. There was a poise about her, a deliberate stillness that made people uneasy, though they could not say why. When she spoke of her family, she did so without hesitation or apology. To her, the Coleman history was not a shadow to be hidden, but an inheritance to be claimed. She called it the work and spoke of finishing what they started, as though it were a duty she had been born to fulfill. The house, under her hand, began to stir again. Curtains were pulled open to let in light, but the rooms did not feel brighter. The air carried the faint smell of something burned long ago, a scent that had never truly left. Sarah cleaned, repaired and rearranged, but she did not erase. She kept the locked room untouched, the symbols on the walls in place. When asked, she would only smile and say, "Some things are meant to remain." In town, opinions about her divided sharply. The older generation, steeped in the stories of the Colemans, kept their distance, muttering that nothing good would come of her return. The younger ones, eager for something different in the quiet valley, found themselves drawn to her. She spoke with a confidence rare for a woman in that time, unafraid to mix talk of the old superstitions with the language of progress. Yet beneath the charm, there was something else, a way she seemed to watch people when they weren't speaking, as if measuring them for a purpose they couldn't see. She asked questions about the land, about old boundaries, about who had been buried where. She walked the fields at night, lantern in hand, pausing at certain spots for long minutes before moving on. Sarah had returned with intention, and those who saw her often felt they were witnessing the beginning of something rather than the end. Whatever work she spoke of, it was clear she meant to see it through. And in the stillness that settled over the valley after her arrival, it felt as though the house itself was listening and waiting. The winter of 1914 came early and stayed without mercy. By the end of November, the sky over the Coleman property had turned a flat, oppressive grey, and it never seemed to lift. Daylight became a dull imitation of itself, the sun hidden behind a ceiling of thick cloud that refused to break. The air grew colder than the season could explain, a deep chill that seeped into bones and lingered there. In the woods, the usual scatter of deer tracks and bird calls vanished. The trees stood bare and silent, their branches unmoving, as if the wind had forgotten them. People in town noticed that the strange weather did not stretch far. Just beyond the ridge, the sun still broke through the clouds on certain days, the snow melted in the afternoons, and the air carried the ordinary bite of winter. But around the Coleman farm, it was as though another season had settled in, a season meant for no living thing. It was during this dim, unending twilight that Sarah began hosting her gatherings. At first, only a few unfamiliar faces were seen arriving at the house after dark, but as the weeks passed, more came. They did not speak to neighbors, and their carriages left no tracks that lasted until morning. The curtains stayed drawn, but those passing on the road swore they could hear the faint hum of voices rising and falling together. Some described it as chanting, others as a kind of low singing in a language that did not belong to the valley. On certain nights there was the sound of water being poured, not in splashes, but in a steady, deliberate stream, as though filling something deep, and threaded through the air, when the wind carried it just right, came the sharp, metallic tang of burning iron. The gatherings ended just before dawn. By the time the first pale light touched the sky, the house would be silent again, its windows dark. Those who worked the fields nearby claimed the snow around the property never stayed white. It turned grey within hours, as if stained from below. No one dared to confront Sarah directly. Some muttered that she was trying to finish the same bargain her ancestors had begun, others that she was calling something home. Whatever she was doing, the land seemed to be holding its breath, the way it had in other strange summers and winters before. Only this time, there was no promise of spring at the end. The sun was gone, and in its absence something else had taken its place. In the second week of February 1915, the storm came without warning. The wind roared down from the hills, driving snow so thick, the Coleman property vanished from sight. For 3 days the road was impassable, drifts rising as high as fence posts, the sound of the wind drowning out every other noise. No light showed from the house during that time, though neighbors claimed they saw a faint orange glow pulsing in the clouds above it. When the storm finally broke, The sky cleared to a pale, brittle blue. A small group made their way to the farm, pushing through knee-deep snow. The gate stood open, the yard covered in a smooth, untouched sheet of white. There were no footprints leading to or from the house. Inside, the air was still and cold, yet it carried the faint smell of smoke and something sharper, a metallic scent that caught in the throat. Melted candles were scattered across the floor, in every room. Their wax hardened into twisted shapes. In the parlor, a perfect circle of ash marked the floorboards, so precise it seemed measured. The ash was deep, as though something large had burned there, but no char marked the wood beneath. In the center of the room stood the stone basin from the locked room upstairs. Its dark surface was split down the middle, a jagged crack running from rim to base. Inside lay only a thin film of black water, unmoving, reflecting the light in a way that made it seem deeper than it could possibly be. The house showed no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, but Sarah was gone. Every guest who had been seen arriving in the weeks before was gone as well. The beds upstairs were neatly made, their quilts undisturbed. Even the kitchen table was set, as though waiting for a meal that would never be eaten. The strangest detail was the floor. In several rooms, the boards were damp, not with melting snow but with water that seemed to seep upward, leaving no puddles yet darkening the wood. It had no smell of rot, no trace of freezing, as if it had come from deep underground. The official report listed the case as unresolved disappearance. The locals told a different story. They said the storm had not trapped Sarah and her guests, it had sealed them in, and whatever they had been calling to in the weeks before had finally answered. The circle of ash, the cracked basin, the wet boards were not the signs of something that had failed. They were the marks of something completed, something that no one would see again, at least not in daylight. For years after Sarah's disappearance, the Coleman property sat in silence. No one claimed the land, no one came to live there. The roof began to sag under the weight of rain and snow, the porch steps softened and crumbled, and the windows, once clouded with dust, shattered one by one until the wind moved freely through the rooms. The forest crept forward inch by inch, sending roots under the foundation and branches through the empty frames. Wild grass rose waist-high in the fields, swallowing the old fence posts. By the 1930s, the house had begun to fold in on itself, its spine broken, its walls collapsing inward. The barn followed soon after, leaving only a scatter of warped boards and rusted hinges. In time, the clearing itself began to vanish, the forest reclaiming what had been taken from it generations before. Yet even as the land erased the house, the stories did not fade. Hunters and hikers passing near the site claimed to hear voices drifting through the trees, faint, overlapping murmurs, never loud enough to make out the words. Some heard footsteps pacing just beyond sight, matching their own stride for stride. Others swore they caught the scent of burning iron on still days, though there was no fire in sight. On rare nights, those walking the ridge above the valley said they saw light where no light should be. A pale, flickering glow in the shape of the upstairs window, hanging in the darkness, like it was still part of the house. It would appear for only a few seconds, then vanish, leaving the woods below in deep shadow. A few tried to find the source, but the forest gave no path, no sign of recent passage. The ground where the house had stood was uneven, littered with rotted beams and the remains of the old stone steps, but no trace of glass or frame remained where the window had been. In the town, the Coleman story became a kind of boundary, a quiet agreement to leave that part of the valley alone. The property was left off maps, the old road allowed to fade beneath grass and saplings. But the memory clung, just as stubborn as the vines that wound through the fallen walls. Time erased the house from the land, but it never erased it from the place itself. And when the light returned to the empty air where the upstairs room had once been, it felt less like a haunting and more like the land remembering exactly what had stood there and what it had kept. In the autumn of 1973, An antique dealer named Howard Bristow purchased a lot of items from an estate sale on the far side of the county. Most of it was forgettable: chipped china, tarnished cutlery, warped picture frames. But buried in the crates were three pieces that caught his attention. The first was a leather-bound ledger, its pages lined with names and dates written in a precise, slanted hand. The second was a faded photograph of a farmhouse with a pale figure in the upstairs window. The third was a heavy black stone basin, its surface split down the middle with an old jagged crack. Howard, a man who prided himself on his knowledge of local history, recognized the name Coleman scratched faintly on the inside cover of the ledger. The photograph, he assumed, was of their house before it collapsed. As for the basin, he could not place it, but it drew his attention more than the others, its cold weight lingering in his hands long after he set it down. Within weeks of bringing the items into his home, strange accidents began. A shelf collapsed in the middle of the night, scattering glass across the floor. His cat vanished without a trace, leaving only a wet mark on the kitchen tiles. More than once, Howard woke to find the ledger open on his desk, turned to a page he had not read. The names there were unfamiliar, until days later, he saw one printed in the obituary column of the local paper. Neighbors said they heard Howard arguing with someone in the small hours, though his voice was the only one they recognized. Once, a friend stopping by to check on him swore he heard the sound of water pouring steadily from somewhere in the house, but when he followed it, the rooms were dry. In December, Howard stopped answering calls. The police found his front door locked from the inside, the lights on, the bed neatly made. There was no sign of struggle, no note, no trace of where he had gone. The ledger, the photograph, and the basin were all missing. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Howard had fallen victim to the curse that clung to those objects, but they had claimed him the way they had claimed the Colemans. Others whispered that the items had simply gone home, taken back by the rightful owner, though no one could say who or what that owner might be. In the years since, the artifacts have never resurfaced in any sale or collection. But those who know the story insist they are still together, waiting somewhere for the next person curious enough or unlucky enough to bring them back into the light. In the late 1980s, a local historian named Evelyn Marr set out to write what she thought would be a straightforward genealogy of the Coleman family. She combed through church registers, census rolls, land deeds, and old newspaper archives, tracing the line from Elias and Margaret down through each generation. What began as a tidy family tree soon grew tangled with strange gaps and unsettling coincidences. She found birth records followed too quickly by death notices, property transfers marked only abandoned, and names that disappeared from the public record without explanation. When she overlaid the Coleman timeline with county archives, the connections deepened. Periods when the family was most active coincided with unusual weather events: a summer of endless storms, a winter without sun. Clusters of missing persons reports often aligned with times when a Coleman heir returned to the valley. The deeper she dug, the more the boundaries widened. The anomalies didn't stop when the house fell into ruin or when the last known heir left town. They appeared in other places, in cities miles away, in small towns where no one would have recognized the name. In each case, Evelyn found a thread leading back to someone carrying Coleman blood. The disappearances, the inexplicable illnesses, the strange environmental changes, all of it pointed to something that moved with the family. She read about a fire in a boarding house where a Coleman widow had been living, flames that left no scorch marks on the structure. She found police records from the 1940s describing a man who vanished from a locked apartment, last name Coleman, leaving the floorboards damp beneath where he had stood. By the time her research was complete, Evelyn's notes filled a dozen binders. Her conclusion was blunt, written in a steady hand at the end of the final volume. It is not the house, it is not the land, it is the blood. She published her findings in a small, self-funded book that never reached wide circulation, but copies found their way into the hands of those who already knew fragments of the story. She ended with a warning that any attempt to contain or destroy the remnants of the Coleman legacy would fail unless the bloodline itself was ended. Evelyn never said publicly whether she believed such a thing was possible, but those who met her in her later years claimed she had the look of someone always glancing over her shoulder, as though certain that somewhere in the world a Coleman still lived and that whatever followed them was never far behind. In the spring of 2004, a development company purchased the overgrown land where the Coleman farm had once stood. The plan was simple: clear the site, lay foundations, and build a row of modern houses. Bulldozers moved in, tearing through decades of roots and soil, erasing the last traces of the clearing. For weeks the work went smoothly, until the day they hit stone. At first, the crew thought it was the remains of an old cellar, but as they dug deeper, the opening widened into a chamber, its walls lined with rock worn smooth by time. The air that rose from it was cool and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent. When the floodlights were lowered inside, their beams revealed something far from ordinary. The floor was layered with bones, human, countless in number, tangled together as though they had been poured into the space. Many were old, brittle and yellowed, but others seemed fresher, their surfaces pale and clean. Scattered among them were carved stone idols, their shapes strange and wrong, the features worn but not enough to hide the faces that were almost, but not quite, human. Work stopped immediately. The foreman called the site manager, who in turn called the county. But by the time the officials arrived, a decision had already been made behind closed doors. The chamber was sealed, the earth pushed back into place, the ground leveled. No report was filed with the state historical registry. The reason given to the crew was vague: liability concerns, unstable ground. The project was abandoned within the month. Those who had been there the day the chamber was opened spoke little about it afterward. A few claimed they had heard something in the dark below before the lights went in, a low, steady hum that vibrated in their ribs. Others said nothing at all. Over the next 2 years, the men who had worked that dig began to suffer accidents. A fall from scaffolding, a car crash on a dry, empty road. One man drowned in a lake he had swum his whole life without trouble. None of the deaths were officially connected, but among the crew, the pattern was impossible to ignore. By 2006, the clearing had vanished again beneath weeds and young trees. The ground looked as though it had never been touched, but the men who still lived kept away from it, and when they passed by on the road, they did not look toward it. The chamber was buried, but the memory of what lay inside and the weight of the air that had risen from it would not stay covered. Today, the Coleman land no longer looks like the place it once was. The forest was cut back, the soil leveled, and in its place stands a pale, modern house with clean lines and wide windows. The family who lives there moved in less than 2 years ago, unaware that the ground beneath their home had been the subject of whispered stories for generations. To them, it is simply a quiet patch of countryside, a place to raise their children away from the noise of the city. At first, everything seemed ordinary. The days were calm, the nights still, but soon neighbors began to notice small things. A shape moving past an upstairs window when the family's car was gone, curtains shifting in rooms that were supposed to be empty, the faint glow of light in the attic, though no one had been up there. The new owners brushed it off when told, tricks of the light, drafts in an old frame, shadows from passing cars. But those who had lived near the land before knew the patterns. The footsteps that creaked across the floor when no one was home. The faint, rhythmic sound of something shifting inside the walls. The way the air in certain rooms seemed to hold its breath, as if listening. One neighbor swore she heard a child's voice coming from the open window one afternoon. The family's children were at school. Another claimed to see the front door swing wide on a windless night, the darkness inside thick and unmoving. Inside, the family has begun to notice things they cannot explain. Toys left in one room turn up in another, A glass of water left on the counter is found empty, though no one has touched it. At night, there are soft, deliberate knocks in the walls, spaced too far apart to be the sound of settling wood. Sometimes, just before sleep, they think they hear breathing, slow, steady, close enough to feel against the skin, though the room is empty. The land has a way of holding on to what belongs to it, and though the old Coleman house has been gone for decades, something in the soil still remembers. The walls of the new home are different, the paint fresh, the foundation poured from clean stone. But when the light fades and the air turns still, it feels the same as it always has. The family doesn't know the stories. They don't know the names or the dates or the symbols that once covered the walls of the house that stood here. But the land knows, and somewhere in the quiet between footsteps, it waits for the next chapter to begin.